recording.
This is even.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we got like half as many coaches as students, so
15 minutes. So, who wants to go first?
You're ready, Sam.
I'm ready. Jefferson stated in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. This is a poor choice of words. In what way are they created equal, and what are they equal to?
He was ready on that one.
Okay, so under a social contract, they're all equal because they are considered all. Under a social contract, they often agree to the same types of things. So yeah, they're equal underneath the social contract.
But we also look at, or actually beg to differ with my colleague, given the fact that we've seen, basically there's a history and a tradition in America, particularly in Western science society, of essentially oppressing minority groups such as African Americans and women. In essence, therefore, maybe they have agreed to social contract, that social contract is not equally applied to them, making them completely unequal then, because they're not being served the same purposes or served the same things.
So then how can you make that statement?
If we look at this in terms of the creation of the Declaration of Independence, what we see is that there's this assertion that all men are created equal from the aspect of perhaps basically colonials trying to assert the fact that they are equal to Englishmen and deserving of the same rights, rather than the inherent statement of all men are created equal. They're making the assumption that all, basically, the status of colonial makes you equal to an Englishman, rather than saying all African Americans are equal with men, or African Americans are equal with Caucasian peoples, etc. And that just has to do more with perhaps a myopic view, and how basically they viewed in terms of what would be doable and what was considerable in terms of the language of academia at that time, the language of politics at that time.
19th century American anarchist Benjamin Tucker is quoted as saying, "If the individual has right to govern himself, all external government is tyranny." How would you respond?
I would respond by saying that governing yourself is essentially being in a state of nature. You have the ability to do whatever you want because it's your own government. You can set up in whatever way you want. But in order to live in a civilized society where you can work with other people and develop together, you need to form a government that includes other people and enter into a social contract that was talked about by both Hobbes and Locke and other natural rights philosophers.
Are we still living under the same social contract formed in the 18th century?
Well, it's not exactly the same social contract. For example, the Constitution has had many amendments to it since the original draft, and that in itself is changing the social contract.
But I would argue that all social contracts, human social contracts, share the same mutual tenets in the sense that all social contracts seek to essentially preserve the rights of certain rights in order to prevent the violation of others. And that essentially you have to make yourself subordinate to some sort of leviathan or some sort of government body in order to have that social contract.
What natural rights do you think the founders missed in the Constitution? If any.
I feel that many natural rights weren't really included in the Constitution. What they included were fundamental rights. The natural rights would be life, liberty, and property, which aren't really explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, and that's largely because, as James Otis said in the 1761 writs of assistance case, natural rights shouldn't be debated or argued because they're there. They're not up for debate, and they shouldn't have to be necessarily explicitly said. So I don't think they missed any natural rights, and I think the fundamental rights that they did miss were included in further amendments.
Anyone else disagree? You guys aren't talking. Quiet. You're ready for Kenny's questions.
There's been a lot of talk of ethics in this presidential election and transition. So, philosophically and practically, what role does ethics play in government?
Well, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson mentions that we have the right to institute government under nature's God, and by that he means under a code of ethics because of that, our government is based off of ethics, and ethics is a foundation for a lot of our principles.
How do we determine which code of ethics to use?
Oftentimes what we look at is, Hobbes and Locke both heavily influenced the philosophy of the foundation, or of the founding. And oftentimes they asserted that ethics were discovered through logic and reason, and that essentially through common sense, you were able to derive what would be right and what is wrong. Most commonly, like, there's the thought of killing another person is wrong, but yet we still have, another form of common sense saying that, well, if that's wrong, then there must be some sort of recompense for that. And that's where we end up having the institution of government to ensure that there is at least one penalty or some mode in which that violation of basic right to life is not violated.
I want to ask a follow-up question. There's a very specific clause of the Constitution that's been invoked recently, the Emoluments Clause, which talks about heads.
Accepting gifts from
I
foreign
got it,
nations.
which talks specifically about the conflicts of interest that might arise when a head of state or president or whomever is accepting bribes or gifts or any sort of emolument or title from a foreign power. Is that really a code of ethics, or is that a code of just kind of conduct? Is there a difference between the two?
Well, you could argue essentially that part of since we have such a heavy emphasis on discovering ethics through essentially common sense and reason, and that part of the line of reasoning in American government particularly is that of classical republicanism, in the sense that essentially there must be representatives who represent the people, or there must be government agents who represent the people in order for government to function well or to function fairly. And for the emoluments clause, what you see with that is that if you're gaining or if you're being bribed from an outside or foreign nation or foreign body, your actions may no longer be influenced by your need to represent the people or by your want to represent the people, but are instead influenced by that foreign government. And in terms of how we've established ethics through logic and reason and through classical republican, basically that line of thought, that would therefore be an ethical issue, and really not necessarily a matter of conduct, but really just a matter of how one represents the people and whether or not that ethically fulfills the contract made in classical republican thought.
Can also look at it in that everything in the Constitution is essentially a code of conduct, because it's telling the president and legislators how they should act in certain situations. So a code of conduct could be interpreted as how you have to act or how you need to act, and a code of ethics would be how you should act. So for example, with Donald Trump's, or President in tomorrow, Donald Trump's involvement with foreign entities such as Deutsche Bank, if he had dissolved those prior.
Deutsche Bank, the one we're concerned about?
So, with Russia. If he had dissolved those prior to the election, then that could be ethically sound, but if he only did it when he was forced to, that could be him acting out of the code of conduct that was written in the Constitution.
With regards to ethics, you mentioned several times that we discover and find them out through reason. So before we find them or discover them, where are they?
Well, essentially what you see is that if we discover and find them through reason, they exist in some practical state in nature, essentially, where if one feels it is unjust to themselves to have their property taken away in a state of nature, if they feel that there must be some protection against that, and if there's basically a mutual enough collection for that, what you end up seeing is there's the development of this common ethical code derived through the logic of, if it is wrong for someone to deprive me of my property, then obviously it must be wrong for me to deprive someone else of that, and that certainly requires a certain amount of introspection as well, but through the development of logic and reason, we end up coming to those conclusions by the practical laws of nature.
Furthermore, because Locke asserted in the state of nature that people naturally come together into a government, you can see that these tenets of logic and reason and building ethics already exists in the state of nature, because they're already coming together to institute those ethics.
So the natural rights philosophy claims that government is based on consent. How do we give our consent and how do we withdraw it?
Well, to give consent in today's government, James Madison, in his correspondence to Thomas Jefferson, stated that by following the rules and just following the laws, we are providing a tacit consent for the government. And by just following the laws, we are basically consenting to the social contract.
We can show our, like, not consenting through the rights that the First Amendment gives us, our right to petition, our right to assembly, and to protest, basically. Martin Luther King Jr. said that by disobeying the law, that's showing one of the greatest respects for it, by giving a sort of criticism on it by protest.
Disobeying all laws?
Well, no, but it
Which
depends on
laws?
like what you're trying to protest against, like what you're against, it's that law or that.
What my colleague is getting at is that Martin Luther King very much applied Mahatma Gandhi's concept of satyagraha, in which one essentially follows the law to its truest extent until that law is therefore unjust and requires basically disobedience of that law for there to be essentially commentary on it. That said, I would actually disagree with my colleague in saying that through following a constitutional means of revolution or of petition or criticism of your government, you're not necessarily revoking your consent of it because you're still following its outlined laws. The matter of basically the modern rescindance of consent today is actually a really big question because of the expanse and the freedoms afforded to the American people by the government. And instead, perhaps it could be seen in maybe the institution of new governments or the institution of new nations, as we've seen by several fringe groups within the Midwest come the turn of the 1950s, or additionally with the assertion against federal land, or basically the assertion against the federal ownership of land that we see with the Bundys.
What fringe groups are you talking about in the 1950s?
There was this
Groups, you said?
There was this backwoods cult in the middle of Illinois shortly following the completion of the national highway system, and because essentially they found themselves completely economically disenfranchised and basically economically unrepresented by how the interstate highway system was structured. These people found it necessary to attempt to form their own micronation in an effect to quote unquote punish the American government, even though that area ended up not being terribly economically viable anyhow.
How do you teach, switching gears, how would you teach civic virtue to students in high school, middle school, or elementary school?
Well, to teach civic virtue, I think the best way is to have a role model for them to follow. For example, President Obama in his farewell address talked about the peaceful transition of power to President-elect Donald Trump, and that's a very civic virtuous thing to do. And if you have those types of role models for children to follow, they can basically follow in their footsteps and be civically virtuous.
Another way to do it is to encourage group activities or to help other students, to make that a priority in the classroom, and not, maybe your grade isn't just dependent on how you do, but how your group does as a whole. So you're teaching students to care for other students because they're not the only ones responsible for the grade, other people are.
Sounds like communism to me.
I mean, that's still that goes on, that's just typical classroom activities.
Additionally, classroom outreach programs where you support volunteerism in your community is very important. Where I grew up in northern New Mexico was a very high fire danger region, basically from the months of early May into late September. And oftentimes what we would do in our schools is that we were organized and encouraged to go out and actually volunteer with the local Forest Service and with the local government to essentially clean up any forest debris or clean up any possible basically excessive fire dangers within the community, and sort of we were educated in the sense of how to contribute to our community and how to preserve our community.
Let's go back to ethics. So you mentioned several times using reason, logic, common sense to find ethical values. There's recently in ethics there's been the development of the branch called care ethics, which says that historically, ethical philosophy has been biased in its assumption that we should use reason and logic to find our ethical values, because historically women have not been allowed education. They have been segregated to the area of care, child care. So, should we continue to use logic and reason to find ethical values, or should we consider care ethics as more of a viable option?
Well, what you're discussing is actually the assertion that Kohlberg's system of ethics is actually very, very male biased based on studies in the late 1960s with males in Chicago, essentially regarding that because he only studied basically young men from a certain ethnic and socioeconomic group, his construction of ethics essentially, and by extension the historical construction of ethics, consistently disregards women, consistently disregards the development of women's ethics, to the point where Kohlberg's system of ethics actually ranked women as less ethically and less morally sophisticated than men, because there's this assertion that because of how women have been socialized recently, their orientation towards the group makes them less developmentally, in terms of morals, sophisticated than men, who oftentimes are considered to then remain ethically interested towards the individual, or ethically interested towards abstract concepts that might transcend society. And I think the argument with that is that it's not necessarily logic and reason that is at fault. It's the assumption that, or it's the assertion that studies of ethics are accurate when only applied to young men, or that's logic and reason are only inherent traits of men. And rather than looking at the perhaps logic and reason of how women are socialized and how women are then developing their own forms of ethics in creating community, which are still applicable and still developed in male-centered ethics in terms of government.
Yeah, we're right, and we don't want to get Sam in any trouble, so don't go on way over. I got a couple quick things. Don't use the African American example. That's like the C answer. Start digging a little bit now. Go into like Native American, Asian American examples in history where they've been repressed as well. The African American, everyone's going to do that. You know, maybe even bring in transgender, other issues that can just spin it in a different way. Build on each other's answers. You got a lot of one-person answers. Don't be afraid to spin it, somebody else pile on, and kind of play to your strengths on that. Don't be too cute on some of the answers, too. Get to those philosophers and examples quickly, especially in your unit. They want to hear you quoting Hobbes and Locke or so. Get there quick. Good job on explaining civil disobedience. That was fantastic, the way you kind of piled on the MLK answer. You probably could have done some better examples on fringe groups. I was looking for some. I didn't know about that example from, but that's a good one.
Yes,
But did they have a name or something?
Yes, I was trying to figure out, so I was about to use the Scientologists, but that's a little.
Well, you know, even
Don't persecute you if you use that answer, so.
no, he's making a joke now.
No,
Find some.
I'm probably one judge.
Maybe find some fringe groups throughout our history. You know, you can go back to KKK. You can, you know, talk something.
That's a
Western state of South Carolina.
Exactly the whole like. But overall, good job. Remember, your unit especially. Get to the examples and the quotes. You guys had it. It took you a little while to get there. Get to those philosophers quicker. Sam.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I hate to say this, but you can't be the first one to answer every question. You gotta let them answer the questions. Guys, you gotta jump in there, 'cause you know, and I saw this with my son's group. He was the only, everybody knew that he was gonna answer the question, so they let him answer the question.